Shalom, everyone. Dr. Dinah here, and welcome to part 2 of our Hanukkah presentation. And today, in this session, we're going to focus in on the biblical perspective versus the historical perspective. So we're going to move out of the whole military campaign following world empire from Babylon until really the Herodian dynasty, looking at the book of the Maccabees, and focus more on elements that might be in the Bible. Are there any? Does the Bible even address Hanukkah? What does it have to say? So let me mention the story of the miracle of the oil. And of course, we mentioned last time that when the Maccabees took control and captured the Temple Mount, it is said, according to the Talmud, and in particular, for those of you who want to look it up, in Babylon, the Babylonian Talmud, it's called Shabbat 21b, but that's where the story is. That's where we got it. And of course, we celebrate it today. But that there was apparently a cruse of oil that was found. It had been stamped by the high priest Onias, and apparently there was only enough for one day. Now, in the temple stood the 7-branched menorah, and it was to be serviced morning and evening, the oil, making sure there was enough oil in the bowls so that there was an eternal flame lit. Now, not necessarily all 7 branches were lit all at the same time, all the time. Some would go out, and then the priest would have to go in and ceremonially replace the oil that was in the vats, in the bowls. And so the goal was to make sure at least one of the lampstand branches was always lit. So that was considered to be the eternal flame. So in this case, the oil only lasted, supposedly would last for one day, but it ended up lasting for 8 days. Hence, Hanukkah is an 8-day holiday. Now, it's not one of the holidays or the festivals listed in Leviticus 23. But it does have a root in the Bible, which we'll get to in a minute here. So this is kind of the story that's been passed down. Some people would argue it's not true. We don't really know, but clearly we find in John chapter 10 that it tells us very specifically that it was the festival of dedication, the feast of Hanukkah, the festival of lights. So we'll get to that in just a second. So today, again, we celebrate by lighting a Hanukkah, which is a commemoration or memorial, if you will, of the menorah, the 7-branch menorah, but it's 9 branches. And it's to commemorate, again, the rededication of the temple that had been contaminated and made unclean by Antiochus Epiphanes, the 4th of the Seleucid kingdom. And so we do light those candles every day. Let me just read a quote here from Josephus. It says, the sons of Hashmoneh, which is the sons of the Hasmonean Empire, made this covenant and took upon themselves a solemn vow, they and the sons of Israel, that they might observe these 8 days of joy and honor as the days of the feasts written in the book of the law. So there's a tie here that Josephus is making between Hanukkah and the feast days that we have outlined in Leviticus 23. And so Hanukkah was instituted then by the Hasmoneans, the dynasty of the Hasmoneans, who technically speaking were not the legitimate line. I would suggest that the key in all of this, in terms of the biblical story, is that Yeshua, of course, his birth is going to be shortly thereafter. Remember, King Herod came into power in 37 BCE, and so Yeshua was born, we're not exactly sure. Some think about 2 or 3 BCE or into the Common Era. But the purpose of his birth at that time was to restore the Davidic dynasty, that he truly was the Messiah, anointed one, king, and actually technically king and high priest office is restored. Now you'll remember that Simon the Hasmonean, one of the 5 brothers, took it upon himself to declare that he was king and high priest. But the legitimate line of the king went back to David, and the legitimate line of the high priest went all the way back to Aaron. So he just took that office and authority upon himself. So Yeshua's birth is a declaration that he is the legitimate newborn king, the one who would lead his people and really all of humanity out of exile, finally, from underneath the weight and oppression of the world's rulers and empires. His birth signified the Messiah would restore the David's throne. So again, all the key, and now in the ancient world, the throne of the king was associated with the temple. Now, sometimes they built a palace adjacent, but technically speaking, the throne of God would be in the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, and the place that the king would, the king would represent his God, in our case, Yahweh, in the holy place. And symbolically speaking, the piece of furniture in the holy place that was represented by the king was the menorah. And we'll touch on that in just a minute. So again, the Feast of Dedication related to the temple and its services. And of course, the more you know about the services, the more this makes sense. And this all included the cleansing of the altar, the cleansing of the temple itself, and cleansing it from the contamination brought on by Antiochus. And of course, he had erected a statue of Zeus in the temple. Once the temple was rebuilt, restored, cleansed, all of this, that meant that the divine presence, the presence of God himself, could return to the temple. So that God could not dwell in a place that was contaminated and unclean. And so the whole idea of the rededication of the temple, and at the time of Hanukkah, was the hope and the belief and trust that Yahweh himself, his presence, his divine presence, would return to the temple, and that would be his throne from which he would rule and reign. So that's quite significant. And again, this is really tied to the menorah, because the menorah is supposed to, the fire in the menorah was kind of a representation or manifestation of God himself. And it, of course, burned inside the holy place. So now that the idea of the divine presence returning, and this is all associated with the Festival of Lights. So there's this association between the light of the menorah, the fire of the menorah burning bright, and the presence of God, and in some respects, the presence of the king himself. It signified then that the rightful monarch was seated on the throne, that he had been enthroned. There is a quote from a temple scroll, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have one called the Temple Scroll, that says somewhere around 150 BCE, a segment of Jews envisioned a future messianic temple. Okay, this is 150 BCE, where there would be the new wine festival to be followed by a new oil festival. So that is shortly thereafter, the Maccabees have taken over the Temple Mount and restored things. So that's kind of interesting. You can actually find that from a scholar named Jacob Milgram. So Hanukkah then served as a memorial, obviously, for kindling the menorah in the holy place, a duty, a ceremony belonging to the priests. They would cast lots every morning to see who would service the menorah. It would be serviced in the morning and in the afternoon, late and middle afternoon, and which the servicing of the menorah in the afternoon was to take the burning, that the menorah's oil would burn all through the night. So they serviced that twice a day, and they would fill up the bowls of the menorah with pure olive oil. And so the olive oil itself had to go through a process. There was what they did. They had these baskets, and the olives would go in there. I think there were 8, if I recall, and they would just pile them one on top of the other, and the weight would basically cause the crushing of the olives and the oil to be drained out. And so the oil was used for the menorah in the temple. It was used for anointing the king and high priest. So this was the first pressing of the oil, and so it was the most important. And again, that takes us back to Hanukkah. Now, I mentioned that the menorah represented a tree. Well, I hadn't said that yet, but the menorah represented a tree, the tree of life in particular, and it was placed in the holy place, and it was said to connect to the tree of life in the garden. And for the ancient world, they identified these trees, the tree of life or whatever, with the king. So kings were very often associated with trees. It's just kind of interesting. Think about Psalm chapter 1, which is about David, King David. And really, if you read the first numbers of Psalms, it's all related to kingship. And it tells us that I know we kind of read that psalm when we think about ourselves, that we are like a tree planted, but the context of it is really King David, that he is like a tree planted in waters, bringing forth fruit in season. So the ancient culture identified kings with trees. And one of the reasons is that the king himself is supposed to be the unifier, the connecting point between the domain of heaven and the domain of earth. The king kind of brought those two spheres together. So since trees were really big and tall, you think about the cedars of Lebanon or something like that, there was this idea in the minds of the ancient world that the king himself would bring the spheres together. That was the purpose. They call it the axis mundi. That was the purpose of a tree, was to unite heaven and earth. That's kind of interesting. And so the king was responsible to do that. And so the menorah, we have a description of it in Exodus chapter 25, and it sounds very much like a tree with almonds, almond bowls, etc. So and it's 7 branches. So again, the menorah was seen to be a tree, and the trunk of the tree was associated with divine kingship. Of course, back in the ancient world, that's how they viewed their monarch, as divinity, as one who achieved godlike status. You certainly see that in ancient Egypt, that the pharaoh was associated with a god. So that was again associated with the tree. Now, the only place that we specifically have Hanukkah mentioned is going to be in John 10. So I would really encourage you to go read that entire chapter. So we have a tendency to just take a verse out of context and maybe discuss and examine it, but you really need to look at the entire chapter. And actually, you really need to look at, in particular, chapters 7 through 10 of the book of John to understand the broader context here. So I would encourage you to go back and read all those chapters. But in John 10, it says, "Then came Hanukkah. It was winter in Jerusalem. Yeshua was walking in the temple around Solomon's colonnade." So that's kind of clear. Your translation probably doesn't say Hanukkah. It might say the Feast of Dedication, something along those lines. So we have a time of year. We have the name of the festival. So we know it's Kislev 25. That was the day, and we'll see why that day is associated with Hanukkah. Kislev is the month, the 9th month, and generally associated with December at some time. So, of course, we have all these debates over the December, the solstice. Was Yeshua born at Hanukkah? Was he conceived at Hanukkah? Was he born at Sukkot? And the writers did not see fit to tell us. So, we have a tendency to read things into it based on our modern understanding. But it wasn't necessarily the point as to argue over when he was born. The point is that he was born the newborn king who would restore the dynasty of King David. So here we are in John 10. It tells us that he was in Solomon's colonnade. And now remember, King Herod, he came into power around 37 BCE, and his whole thing was like he built stuff on steroids. And so he was the one who expanded the temple. I believe it was about 45 acres up on the Temple Mount. And, this expansion here is just this great building project, the temple seen as one of the wonders of the ancient world, really. And so Solomon's colonnade was this sort of long pillared walkway that ran the length of the eastern wall of the temple. It was open on one side as a colonnade. On the other side, it was overlooking the Kidron Valley. And there were rows of columns of pillars. They were decorated, and the tops, again, were decorated all the way up to the ceiling. So the imagery of these pillars in Solomon's colonnade is the imagery of an arboretum, like a garden. So that's kind of interesting as well. And then it goes on to tell us in that chapter some very, what seems like kind of cryptic, ethereal type language. Like, what does it even mean? So Yeshua is called the gate to the sheepfold. He's called the good shepherd. It says that he is given authority to lay down his life. And he's speaking and pushing back against those who came to steal, kill, and destroy. Now, typically the way we interpret that passage, because we never seem to put the entire chapter back into the context of Hanukkah, we associate those that come to steal, kill, and destroy with Satan and demons and all that sort of thing. But if you actually read it in context, who's being addressed, there could be multiple layers of this, but he is certainly addressing the corrupt leadership. That, remember, the high priest is not the high priest from the line of Aaron going all the way back. We have Herod, actually kind of declaring himself high priest, Rome had appointed him as king, and so he appoints the high priest he wants. And the family, there was one family in particular of the high priest Annas, and all his family members served as high priests. Well, he was not the legitimate priest. So Herod's not the legitimate king. The high priest is not the legitimate high priest. And so these are the ones that have come to steal, kill, and destroy. They have become very corrupt. And we did mention in our last episode that there was a certain, the aristocracy of the time had really kind of joined itself at the hip to the move of Hellenism. So you do have some corruption. Now, not every priest is corrupt. That's not what we're trying to say here, but the structure of the leadership was. And so Yeshua, I believe, is speaking out against that. And again, he mentions himself being the gate. So we're going to talk about that in just a second. What does that even mean? He's the gate of the sheepfold. So the sheepfold anciently was actually a euphemism, if you will, for the temple itself. So now we think of Yeshua as he's saying that he's the gate to the temple. Of course, he also says that his body is a temple. So that's kind of interesting. But the temple itself was synonymous in the ancient world with heaven. So the way they looked at it back then was that the temple was a place, a sacred space located to connect heaven and earth. It's like the spot in between these two spheres. And so when you ascended the mountain and went up the mountain and entered into the temple, the thinking was that you had entered into heaven. So the domain of the temple, heaven, etc., was the domain of the king, the high priest. And of course, the domain of earth was the domain of his subjects. And so heaven, again, was associated with heaven. Temple was associated with heaven. So the idea of the gate of heaven, maybe you've heard that expression before, is the idea of the entry into the heavenly abode or the heavenly realm of the deity, because deities would take their place on top of the mountain in the temple. Now, in the ancient world, for example, we have ziggurats, and so on top of the ziggurat, and they were filled with dirt. There wasn't actually life going on inside the ziggurat, but on top of it was the place where the deity kind of rested, where his where his inner chamber would be. So the gate is then considered to be the entry into the heavenly abode. And in this case, it's the entryway into the temple. Again, the temple connected heaven and earth. So the temple served as a place that was an overlap between heaven and earth. And so the gate of heaven in the temple would be seen as the entryway into the inner sanctum or into the Holy of Holies. So Yeshua is saying, I am the gate the temple being associated with the sheepfold, but in particular, the gateway into the Holy of Holies, because he is ultimately the legitimate high priest. We see this kind of language in the story of Jacob back in Genesis 28. Remember, he was on the Temple Mount, which would later be where the temple was built. Doesn't tell us, it calls it Bethel. And he's lying down with his head on a rock. And then there's a ladder, and you see angels ascending and descending. This is the same kind of picture. The ladder is the gateway into heaven, or into the Holy of Holies, because the Holy of Holies represented the inner sanctum and heaven itself. And so the angels were like priests ascending and descending, just like you would have in the temple. And so that Yeshua served, he was saying, declaring that he was the gateway to heaven, really, and into the presence of his Father, Yahweh. And you think about that verse in John as well. No one comes to the Father except through me, because this is gate language. He is declaring himself to be the gate. Now, another aspect of this is the use of the term shepherd. I am the shepherd. I am the great shepherd. Now, you'll remember in our last session, I mentioned that shepherds in the ancient world were ruling kings. This is very much the case in ancient Mesopotamia. So he's saying, I am the good shepherd. So he's making a declaration of kingship and rulership. I am the king. And so this is true of the ancient Near East world. They were, once again, divine kings. Human rulers were shepherds, and their subjects were sheep. We point back to King Cyrus in Isaiah 44. You can see that in verse 28, where it says, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill my purpose. And of course, the shepherd's staff being associated with that, symbolizing the ruler's power and eminence. So I want you to kind of think about what's going on here. Yeshua is making all kinds of references to his authority as the rightful king, in declaring himself a shepherd, in declaring himself the gate, in declaring himself the Son of God, which we'll talk about in just a second. And so the language in there talks about that the sheep, the true sheep, do not follow a stranger. That is, they do not follow an illegitimate king, another king. And again, the Herodian, Hasmonean dynasties were not of the sheepfold. They were not of the royal line of the house of Judah. The legitimate dynasty is of King David, and only Yeshua was the rightful heir that could fulfill that office. So one of the terms that Yeshua even says in that chapter, he says, I am Ben Elohim, which means I am the Son of God. Now, in the ancient world, the Son of God was also a title for a king. So any king who inherited the throne from his father was called the Son of God. So, for example, Caesar of Rome himself was called the Son of God. This is not an unusual title, because remember, these kings associated themselves with divine kingship and considered themselves as the gods. Okay, now in this case, we know Yeshua isn't declaring himself to be one of the gods of the pantheon. He is technically the Son of God, but he's also a title that was held by the descendants of King David. So in reading the chapter, you could say that the temple leadership of the time, they're asking him if he is the true Messiah. They're asking him, are you of the royal line of David? Are you the legitimate heir to the throne? And now they're not going to be happy with that, okay? Because they got their own guy they're worshiping, King Herod. And King Herod is completely corrupt. Again, the Romans appointed him king. You know, he's bribing and blackmailing, Lord knows what else. This is what tyrants do. This is what illegitimate rulers do. And so in steps Yeshua in the Solomon's colonnade at the time of the Feast of Dedication, and he is stepping on their turf. And he is making a declaration that he is the rightful, legitimate ruler and high priest. So these guys are not happy about this. And so these are the ones that come to kill, steal, and destroy. And I would, not that we necessarily know is from the Hasmoneans or from the Herodians, but the leadership structure of the time is illegitimate. And Yeshua is the only legitimate one. And so what he is making a declaration of in the cleansing of the temple and his declaring his true and rightful rulership is so that the divine presence of God could return to the temple, because he is the anointed king, the anointed one, anointed with the oil, like the olive oil, like the menorah. Now, I mentioned earlier that the central shaft of the menorah is associated with divine kingship. This is true all through the ancient Near East, not just for Israel, but when you go back to that world, that the idea of a tree of life and the central shaft of the tree of life was just associated with divine kingship. And so the menorah functioned, if you will, symbolically as a tree of light and a tree of life, both things. This was the purpose of the menorah, to represent the true king of Israel, who would ultimately deliver his people. So John 10, the Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, is also the Feast of Lights. We want to emphasize that, and it's tied up to the kingdom and tied up with the rightful heir to the throne, that he is Yeshua, declaring that he is the Messiah, the rightful anointed king. He is the Son of God. He is the divine king and son of Yahweh. He is the legitimate heir to the throne and to the Davidic dynasty. So now that's John chapter 10. And what we want to do is we want to back up into John chapter 7, because they all kind of connect here. So if you go back and read starting in John chapter 7, you will find that that is a particular feast, and it's called the Feast of Tabernacles, or in Hebrew, Sukkot, the Feast of Booths. And it is called the Festival of Lights. Isn't that interesting? And there's a relationship then between Sukkot and the Festival of Lights and Hanukkah, which is called the Festival of Lights. Now, at the time of Sukkot, or the Feast of Booths, in the temple, they would erect 4 giant posts. And on top of these posts, they would put these giant vats. And in the vats, they would pour olive oil. And it was said that this served, the wicks would come from the undergarments of the priests. They would put that, the old undergarments, they would put that in the vats, fill it up with oil, and set it ablaze. And so it was said that the oil, the lit, these posts that were lit at Sukkot would be so bright, not only would it light up the courtyard or the temple or the city of Jerusalem, but it was said that it would light things up all the way to Jericho. So unlikely that's the case, but the point is the light was very bright. And according to a number to the Mishnah, and I think some other sources, the temple, actually, I think it comes from Genesis Rabbah, which is a commentary on Genesis, a later commentary. It said there that the temple and Jerusalem were both called the light of the world. So isn't that interesting? So the temple is called the light of the world, and Jerusalem was called the light of the world. And Yeshua is telling us he's the light of the world, and that those 4 posts that are erected at Sukkot in the court of the women was called the light of the world. So we got a lot of light of the world going on here, but all of the essence of the light of the world connected to the menorah is speaking to us of the presence of God in the midst of in the temple and in the midst of the people. The fire, the oil burning in the menorah was associated with the divine presence, and even more so well, I don't want to get into it too much, but the idea of wisdom is connected to the tree of life. You can see that in the book of Proverbs. So the menorah was a symbol for the spiritual and physical light that radiated from the temple. So when you move from chapter 7 in John to chapter 8 and into chapter 9, it talks about the blind who will be no longer walking in darkness. So now we have all this light language, again, connecting to the menorah and the oil, and speaking of those that are blind. Now, it's speaking of one person at that time, but he could be the representation of kind of where things have ended up with Israel. Is he speaking and addressing to the leadership in the temple? I mean, we don't really know, but I would submit that the blind man was a symbolic element of all mankind who were walking in darkness until the light of the menorah, the light of God, comes forth. So one of the things that you find with the leadership, they're associated with the blind, and they associate the blind with the Gentiles. So in their view, Gentiles were blind. They were unclean, they were contaminated, et cetera, et cetera. So in Isaiah 8 and 9, you're probably familiar with this language. It says, he will bring glory by way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Now, Galilee of the Gentiles at this time, the time of Yeshua, is the center of the Roman world, the center of the Roman garrisons, etc. And it goes on to say that the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. Upon those living in the land of the shadow of death, light will shine. They will rejoice before you like the joy in harvest. So it's pointing us to Sukkot, which is said to be the festival or the feast of the nations, the ingathering of the nations. And so all of this is associated with oil. And I would just submit that Yeshua's, yes, he was born King of the Jews at perhaps the time of Sukkot or Hanukkah, we're not sure, but representing the light coming into the world in terms of kingship. But the light of the world is Yeshua, is a declaration to all humanity. Okay, it wasn't just about the Jews, it was about all of humanity, because the focus here in Isaiah is dealing with the Gentiles. They're the ones that lived around in what the area we call the Decapolis on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and considered to be a very dark world in which Rome had total control of that area. And you'll remember in the Gospels that Yeshua was kind of coming and going across the Sea of Galilee. So he would cross over to the eastern side of the Galilee where all the Gentiles lived. So Gentiles can mean nations, non-Jews, whatever. But the point is those that are outside the sort of economy of Israel and its relationship to the temple, these are the ones that Yeshua came to be king over all humanity, not just the Jews. Of course, they were chosen by God for Yeshua to come forth and to serve purposes in multiple ways. But the idea was for the light to go out to all of mankind. And so this rejoicing at the time of the joy and the harvest, again, speaking of Sukkot, Sukkot has multiple names, but it is known as the Festival of the Nations. So you might remember from the book of Zechariah, 14:16 in particular, and it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Festival of Tabernacles. So it's, now we look at the Maccabees. Now, obviously, John 10 isn't referring back to the Maccabees necessarily, unless Yeshua is speaking against the illegitimacy of their reign. Of course, their reign has ended quite a number of years earlier, and we have Herod in power, so it's a possibility. But the question was really, I think the key in understanding where the date of Hanukkah came from is going to go back to Haggai the prophet. So Haggai is a prophet around 539 BCE, which is taking us back to the time of the Persian kings. So you'll remember, we talked a lot about this in the first session, the various kings from Cyrus on to Darius and to Xerxes. So that's kind of our framework, and that likely the temple was built and dedicated in 515 BCE. So Haggai's main message to the Jews who were returning from exile from Babylon, now Persia, was finish the temple. So the completion of the temple signified for them, once it was complete, that God's presence had returned to the sacred space. And so God stirred up in the hearts of two people, in particular, the governor of that time. His name was Zerubbabel, if you will. And he was of the royal line of David. If you look closely, he was the governor of Yehuda. And if you read in Matthew, chapter 1, and you go through the genealogy of Yeshua, you will see that Zerubbabel is in that line. So he is in the Davidic dynasty. It's mapped out in Matthew 1 through the line of Solomon. So it tells us that this is the king. So from David to Solomon on down. The high priest at the time was Yehoshua ben Jehozadak, and he was the high priest, as I said, and he together with Zerubbabel and the people began to do the work on the temple at the time of Haggai. Now it gives us some dates in Haggai, which is interesting. And it says that on the 24th of the 9th month, so that's the month of Kislev, it's the 9th month, and it's the month in which we have Hanukkah, and Hanukkah is on the 25th. So here we are on the 24th. And it says that Zerubbabel and the high priest are having to address issues of uncleanness. Remember, if you touched a corpse, you were put in a state of uncleanness. Didn't necessarily mean you were in sin, but you were in a state of impurity, a contaminated state, and you had to go through a process before you were able to enter into the temple. Remember, going into the temple signified as if they were entering into heaven, into the presence of God. So this status of uncleanness prevented one from entering and serving in the temple. And it says that on this day, the 24th of Kislev, the day before Hanukkah, it says they needed to set their hearts back to God from this day forward. So the day forward is going to be Kislev 25 or Hanukkah. And it states, I will shake the heaven and the earth and overturn the throne of kingdoms and destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations. Okay, so on the 25th, we have this idea of God shaking the heavens and the earth and overthrowing the rule of the kingdoms of the earth that would come to destroy Israel. And he would destroy the strength of those kingdoms. Now, we just went through a whole bunch of kingdoms in the intertestamental period. So what kingdom are they dealing with now, present day, for Yeshua and the temple in John 10, is they're dealing, of course, with Rome, ultimately the most powerful empire on planet Earth at that time. It goes on to say that he'll overturn the chariot and its riders, so the horses and their riders will fall. I hope you remember that same expression about Egypt and Pharaoh. So this is God shaking the heavens and earth, and he's taken down the world empires so that the place of the presence of God can be restored, and the king who will come to defeat all the nations will come from the line of David, and he will take his seat on the throne. So we have this giant battle going on between the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of our Lord and our Messiah, and he shall reign forever and ever. This is the battle of the ages, and I would dare say we're in the same battle today. We are today watching as world empire snuffs out and seeks to destroy all of humanity. And so either we put our lot with Yeshua the Messiah and allow him to take his rightful place on the throne, which today would be the throne of our hearts or our community or the greater community around the world, that he has taken his seat on the throne. We need to recognize him seated on the throne. Who is in charge? Are you going to worship at the altar of world empire and rulers and elites and that corrupt world? Or are you going to worship Yeshua the Messiah as king and his father Yahweh? So the idea of rebuilding the temple, the restoration of the Davidic king, all comes to bear in the book of Haggai. And so on that day, the 25th of Kislev, which will later be Hanukkah, it says that I will set you, Zerubbabel, like a signet ring. I will restore the kingship through Zerubbabel at that time, related to Hanukkah. It's kind of interesting. So the rightful, technically king, although he's governor, he's not, there's no temples before they finish building, so he's not actually seated on the throne, but he is the governor of Judea, and he is of the household of David. Again, Matthew 1, verse 12 in particular, served as governor under Darius the Mede. And Darius, of course, had endorsed the completion of the temple, 515 BCE again. And Zerubbabel is considered the shepherd. He serves as a shepherd to his people in this kind of kingly role. And so he began to he began the building of the house. So you can read all that in Ezra 5, in particular 1 and 2. Now we go back and we remember that Cyrus was the one who had issued the decree, right, to rebuild the temple. And so he let the people go back, and that was their job. It just took a whole lot longer than they had anticipated to actually build the temple. So I would submit that the Maccabees are drawing in on that when they choose the date, because what goes on, the cleansing of the temple, the rededication of the temple, etc., it seems to me that they're choosing that date on purpose by design, and they are trying to align themselves then with Haggai the prophet's message to rebuild, and tying it to Zerubbabel and the dynasty, perhaps. But as we have been talking about, unfortunately, by the time we get to the Hasmoneans, even though they have taken the temple, restored it, cleansed it, they kind of went south, and they were not the legitimate rulers of Israel. So they're kind of, we see the same thing, this idea of cleansing and rededication and restoring with King Hezekiah. So when we read in Isaiah 7 through 9, that's where we hit 9 is where we have the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. But in chapter 7, we see the sign of Emmanuel, and out from a virgin will conceive and bring forth a son and call his name Emmanuel. Now that's, unfortunately, when we read that, if we read it closely, we'll see that it's not really talking about Isaiah. That whole message is about Hezekiah, because his father was King Ahaz, who was really a bad guy. He even had an altar commissioned by an altar that he saw in Damascus, which he thought was a really cool altar. He wanted it built in the temple in Jerusalem. So there are actually 2 altars at that time. He was actually from the house of David, and his son that would come forth, and his name called, or the idea that God is with us, the divine presence is with us when the rightful king sits on the throne. His name was Emmanuel. And so this is really about King Hezekiah. It's all related to kingship. Now, at the time of King Hezekiah, he was having to fight off the Assyrian army, in which he did. It tells us that 185,000 were destroyed, and we're not sure how. It tells us angels came and took care of that. But this idea of the people walking in darkness, seeing a great light once again, the idea of multiplying the nation and increasing the joy, we already talked about that. So this Prince of Peace, the Nasi, in that context at that time, is going to be Hezekiah, the child that is born, and the government being on his shoulders because he is the rightful king, and he restores essentially the throne of David, because his father Ahaz basically he allowed the temple to fall into disrepair and to be contaminated by the nations around him. Again, go back and read Ezra 6, talks about the completion of the temple, all again tied probably to the Maccabees in some way. And now at that time, that the temple was completed in Adar, the month of Adar, which is in the spring, the month before Passover, at the time of the reign of Darius. So there were great celebrations, obviously, and the rededication and all that sort of thing. So the key in all of this, I would say, is to understand that Hanukkah is centered around the temple, this idea of dedication, Chanukah, because that is the place of the presence of God and the central institution of all of life in Israel. It's life and its government, its religious life, its judicial life, its economic life, its agricultural life, its administrative life, its monarchical life. And so again, Antiochus Epiphanes had taken control and contaminated all. And so it all needed to be restored. So I had talked about, eventually back to the kind of the Hasmonean period, they had appointed the priests at times, questionable, of their legitimacy, but they did cleanse the altar and the holy place like Hezekiah had done. And so they did pull down the contaminated altar of burnt offering. It tells us that they laid the stones from the altar in a convenient place until a prophet like Messiah would come along and decide what to be done. So this thread of Messiah, really the rightful king, takes us all the way back for sure to Haggai and on forward. Now, one of the best places you can really read about the intertestamental period in particular is in Daniel. So again, go read the whole book. You've got a lot of reading to do. But I talked about last time the statue that was erected, probably the statue of Marduk, the chief god of the pantheon, and how Xerxes had taken that statue and burned it down. But you see all of this empire type language in the book of Daniel, talking about the Babylonian period, the Greek period, the Persian period, and he's giving us a pretty good synopsis. Now, I know there's argument over, but it's likely the case that Daniel wrote, and is probably a pseudonym, wrote around 105 BCE. So he is giving us the history of what has happened. I don't believe that it was a prophecy and him writing it in the 6th century of all the things that were going to happen. I believe that he wrote it after the fact, and he's giving us a pretty good outline of the history. And so his book, of course, is written in apocalyptic style, and he is basically dealing once again with the Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Rome, but we won't get into that. So one of the things to remember that these empires were always associated with beasts, and that's pretty common in the ancient world. And the idea of animals that were considered to be hunted by kings. So the Babylon was associated with a lion, Persia with the bear, Greece with the ram and the leopard. So the idea of hunting and beasts was another association with kings in the ancient world. Hunting was considered the ideal sport of kings, and it was tied to kingship. And so beasts were synonymous with the rulers of foreign empires. And so the ultimate sign of a king's rulership or his authority was his ability to subdue the world's animals, the world's most powerful animals, which the most powerful animal was considered to be the lion. So hunting actually showcased the king's ability to shepherd and protect his flock. So these beasts are outside of the kingdom. They are interlopers and marauders, and they're ones who have come to kill, steal, and destroy. That is the nature of beasts. And so Daniel talks a lot of that. The hunting was a symbol of authority, and the lion hunt in particular actually displayed the king's prowess. So beasts were those who came out of the sea or the nations. You'll remember Nimrod was called a mighty hunter, a powerful hunter of men, according to Kyle and Delitzsch. Hunting is connected to the establishment of a kingdom. And the way they hunted is the way military in military terms, kings defeated other nations and took control. Josephus said of Nimrod, for example, he gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God but to bring them into constant dependence on his own power. So the historian, back to Josephus, let me just read this quote. He said, people were so very glad to see customs restored after a long time, and they unexpectedly regained their freedom of worship. So they made it a law for their posterity to keep a festival on account of the restoration of their temple. Worship for 8 days. From that time to this, we celebrate the festival and call it lights. And I suppose the reason, because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us. So you see there's association that Josephus is making with Hanukkah and deliverance and freedom from oppression under tyranny. And that is the state of mankind from beginning to end. And so the one who came to deliver mankind, all of mankind, from tyranny is going to be Yeshua the Messiah. So the birth of Yeshua, the newborn king, a picture of a new temple, a restored covenant, the idea of the return of the presence of God. Through him, he, the legitimate heir to the throne, he in his birth will restore order in Israel at the time, but order for all of humanity, for all of the future. He is the legitimate heir to the throne who will rebuild the temple. And so the legitimacy of the throne at that time, it's not King Herod. He might have the power, but it's not him. Joseph, remember back that the royal line of King David, going back to Abraham through Solomon, Joseph, speaking of Yeshua's father, is explained and expanded on there in Matthew chapter 1. This is the way Matthew is introduced, is the birth of the newborn king, who is the rightful ruler. Yeshua, called Messiah, the anointed king, who represents the light and life of the world. restoring the people from exile. So not just exile from the empires, but exile from death, the permanent separation of God, the exile that we have created for ourselves due to our own sin, from our addictions and our abuses of power, or whatever you want to say. Again, Yeshua personified all of this. And it tells us that Miriam, she will give birth to a son, and you'll call his name Yeshua. And he will be like Emmanuel, going back to King Hezekiah, that the Virgin Miriam would conceive and give birth to a son, once again connecting us to the story of King Hezekiah in Isaiah, who would come and ultimately restore and cleanse the temple. Emmanuel, or God with us, manifested in fire, in the menorah, the light of the world that is in the holy place, the eternal flame. And it tells us even in Micah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Luke speaks of the same thing. We can read about the angel Gabriel being sent to the Galilee, the Virgin Miriam being engaged to Joseph of the house of David. That's key. And he will be called Great, Ben Elyon, another example of the title for king. And ultimately he will defeat the world empires, even though it doesn't look like it in the natural in the first century when they are under the thumb of Rome and Herod and the temple leadership. But he will reign over the house of Jacob for all eternity, and it will be a kingdom without end. And the idea that this is part of Miriam's song, and we see that the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, will come upon you, and the power of El Elyon will overshadow you. And he will be born Ben Elohim, the Son of God. And Miriam's song goes on to say, he has brought down rulers from thrones and exalted the humble. And so Yeshua's mission was to take down the rulers of empire, the corrupt political elites, to free the world from the corruption that they bring and the oppression that they bring and the death and the slavery and the destruction and the consequences that the ruling tyrants bring out onto the world. Yeshua has come to deliver and set the captives free. The idea of Yeshua is so much greater than just what he did in Israel, but it's what he has done for all mankind throughout history, that he will deliver the people from tyranny. And so at this juncture, we can say we have not quite realized this final freedom and deliverance even in our civilized world, but we can stand on the message that if the Son will make you free, you shall be free indeed. And so at this time, our liberty, our freedom, you can see kind of tied up in the Festival of Lights. So I hope that this is a special Hanukkah for you, and you'll dedicate yourself, your temple, rededicate and cleanse, and be prepared to worship your King, for he is indeed the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So thank you for joining me for this Hanukkah special. And it's been a blessing to be able to share lots of information, but hopefully you have a really great understanding of Hanukkah in a way that you didn't have before. Thanks again. Shalom.